I spotted her before I knew what she was. Just a dark shape on the pale slope staked to the ground, like a warning no one would read. The wind dragged at her hair, the sun burning what the cold hadn't already taken. My mule stamped and tossed his head uneasy at the smell that rode the air. She didn't move, not even when I called out, and by the time I reached her side I could see her lips split, her skin raw where the dress had fallen open. Whoever had left her here had meant for the buzzards to finish the job. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever seen a moment where one choice might change the course of your whole life. My name is Cormac Wade. I've been riding the New Mexico telegraph lines for near 10 years now, ever since I left Illinois behind. The work is lonely, but it keeps a man honest, just me, my mule and the wire humming above the trail. I grew up in a place where neighbors looked out for each other, where a man's word mattered more than his coin. My folks kept Sabbath and supper both, no matter how lean the month. We learned to patch what we had to plant in season and to share the harvest without counting bushels. That sort of life doesn't make a man rich, but it keeps him steady. Out here it's different. The little towns along the wire might be just a handful of buildings, but money still changes hands faster than the weather shifts. Railmen talk in thousands, land speculators in tens of thousands, and neither group cares what it costs the ones who've been here all along. I've seen homesteaders turned out with nothing but what they could carry, all for a line on some clerk's ledger back east. That's why I settled in the canyon, no railroad to eye my roof beams, no banker to measure my worth in dollars per acre. Still, the land doesn't promise peace. The war left its mark, and not just on me. Folks carry their own ghosts, their own reckonings, and the desert has a way of drawing them into the open. I've mended lines in storms, in heat that cracked the earth, and in country so still you could hear your own pulse. But I'd never come across anything like what I saw that afternoon, a living person left in the dust like a carcass miles from shelter. I knew enough not to linger in the open. The ridges hid riders well, and a man could disappear without leaving more than a scuff in the sand. I checked the horizon before I unshouldered my rifle. Nothing moved but the heat. Still, my hand stayed close to the stock as I stepped toward her, the light glinting off the beads that still clung to the torn edge of her dress. When I cut her loose, she crumpled against me, light as a child, her skin fever-warm, despite the chill wind sliding down from the rocks. I lifted her onto the mule, one arm around her, to keep her from sliding off. 4 miles of rough ground lay between us and my cabin, and the sun was already leaning west. I didn't know her name, where she'd come from, or why she'd been left like that. All I knew was that she wouldn't last the night without a roof, water, and heat. By the time the canyon walls rose up around us, the air had cooled and the shadows stretched long. The mule's hooves sounded sharp against the rock as we reached the cabin door. I carried her inside, the smell of old wood smoke wrapping around us. She stirred once, just enough to clutch at the edge of my coat, then went still again. I set her on the cot, covered her with the blanket, and reached for the kettle. Tomorrow there would be questions to ask, maybe trouble to answer for. But for that night, the only sound was the water coming to a boil, and the faint, uneven breath of the stranger I'd brought home. She didn't stir until well past sunrise. I'd been outside checking the mule's hobbles and gathering kindling from the shadow side of the ridge when I heard the cot creak. When I stepped inside, she was awake, but holding still, her eyes tracking every movement I made. The blanket was pulled high under her chin, her fingers gripping the edge like it was the last thing tethering her to this world. I set a tin cup of water on the small table beside the bed, the steam from the kettle soft in the chill air. "It's there if you want it," I told her, then went back to the stove. For a long minute she didn't move. Then she pushed herself up, her bare feet finding the floor. She winced, but steadied herself, keeping the blanket around her shoulders. Her hand shook as she reached for the cup, drinking in small swallows that sounded loud in the quiet room. When she set it down, she spoke for the first time in a rough, rasping tone. Why? The word carried more weight than sound. I turned from the stove. Leaving you there, I don't know. Didn't seem right to ride past. She held my gaze for a moment, eyes sharp under the weariness, then looked away. After a while, she asked, "Where is this?" I told her we were about 4 miles from where I found her, deep in a canyon no one much used. Her brow tightened, as if sorting through pieces of memory. How long, she asked. A day and a half, maybe 2. She gripped the blanket tighter, her knuckles pale. Then she said her name Sana, like she needed it spoken aloud to keep it. I repeated it and gave her mine. That was all we said for a time. By late morning, I'd set a small bowl of beans and cornbread on the table, the kind of meal a body could manage after going too long without. She didn't move at first, just sat watching the steam curl from the bowl. Then she slid one foot to the floor, then the other, and stood with care. The deerskin dress she wore was torn at the shoulder and across the chest, but she kept the blanket wrapped around her. Each step toward the table was measured, her legs unsure. When she sat, I asked, "Was it your tribe?" Her spoon hovered above the beans. "Yes." She paused, then added, "They said I brought sickness. Bad luck, unclean." I didn't say anything, just watched her eat a few small bites. "I didn't," she said, after a moment. "I believe you," I told her. She gave a faint shake of her head. "You don't know me." I looked at her square. I know what I saw. We let the silence settle, the fire ticking in the stove, the only sound. She asked why I lived out here, and I told her the war ended, but left too many ghosts for me to go back east. She nodded once and said the same. When I asked if she had somewhere else to go, her answer was short. No. I told her she could stay as long as she wanted. No one would bother her. That night I laid my bedroll by the fire outside, telling her I'd be near but not too close. She didn't argue. The stars were bright against the black rim of the canyon, and the wind was light enough to carry the faint scent of cedar smoke from the stove. I listened for movement inside, but heard none. She was still wary, but she hadn't asked me to send her away. The next morning, she asked from the cot. "You always sleep outside," I said. "Only when someone else needs the bed." She asked about the ghosts I'd mentioned. I kept my hands busy feeding the stove before I told her my wife and daughter had died in the same week back in Illinois. Fever. I left after. She didn't press for more. By the time I came back from checking the traps near the creek, she'd dressed as best she could. One torn sleeve was tied at the shoulder to keep it from falling, her hair gathered into a loose braid. The blanket lay folded on the bed. She stood barefoot watching the door like she half expected someone to come through it. I hung the rabbit from my belt hook and told her we'd boil it slow with beans. She stepped over to the table where my tools and spools of wire sat. "What is your work?" she asked. I told her I kept the telegraph lines running sometimes, riding 50 miles to fix a break. She ran her fingers over a coil of copper. "Why, here," I shrugged. No one else wanted it. I liked the quiet. Her expression softened slightly at that. The day took on a shape without either of us saying so. She swept the floor while I cleaned the rabbit, the steady rhythm of the broom bristles almost comforting. At the table, she asked if I'd had family. "Now you don't," she said quietly when I nodded. "That's right." After a moment, she added, "Me too." She told me about the illness, how some of the old ones and a child had died, how she wasn't sick but was blamed anyway. They tied her at night, took her to the rock fields in the morning, and left her there. If the desert didn't take me, she said I must be cursed. I set the spoon down and told her she wasn't cursed. She looked at me, asking how I knew. "Because you're still here." Later, she stood at the door, hand resting on the frame, staring out toward the strip of sunlit canyon where the mule grazed. "If I go, I die." I told her she didn't have to go. "If I stay," she began, then stopped. "You do what you want. Stay as long as you like. Don't owe me anything." She stepped back inside without answering, sat down and finished her stew. That evening she lit the kettle herself and cleared the bowls without being asked. As I moved to head outside for the night, she looked up. "You don't need to sleep on the ground." I met her eyes and agreed. I laid the bedroll near the hearth across the room from the cot. She settled under her blanket without flinching, her breathing steady as she fell asleep. The days that followed found their own rhythm. I'd rise early to tend the mule and check the southern ridge, and she'd sweep, fold the bedding, and keep the water pot full. On the 5th day, she stepped outside to sweep the stoop, the morning sun catching on the beads that still clung to her dress. The tear at the neckline had been patched with a scrap from one of my old undershirts. It wasn't neat, but it held. That afternoon, she boiled the rabbit bones for broth while I worked at the table repairing a cracked relay box. She sat across from me watching my hands. "You use this for messages?" she asked. I told her towns once waited on a single wire for word of war or peace rain or drought. She ran her fingers along the copper coil. "I prayed someone would come," she said quietly. I looked up. Someone did. We walked together to the creek later, her carrying the linen cloths to wash while I filled the pail. She moved lighter now, her head higher, her shoulders looser. At the water's edge, she asked if I'd been a soldier. "Union Army," I said, "mostly scouted fixed lines back then, too." She asked if I'd lost many. "Too many," I told her. The air between us stilled. She said she saw death in my eyes, and I nodded. It never really goes. When we returned, she told me she wanted to help more. I showed her how to strip old wire and tie sections that could be reused. She learned quick, her fingers nimble and sure. As the sun dipped, she finished coiling a length on her own. I watched, she said simply. That night, she didn't go to bed first. She sat by the stove with the blanket around her shoulders, watching the embers fade, her eyes less guarded than before. The quiet between us began to feel different. It wasn't the kind that weighed heavy on the chest anymore. By the end of the 2nd week, it had a shape chores and the morning wire repairs after evenings by the fire. She moved through the cabin without hesitation, now setting the kettle or tidying the shelf, not looking to me for permission. I'd find her standing at the doorway at first light, watching the canyon before the sun reached it. One morning, she was mending a tear in the patched scrap I'd given her for her dress, when she asked, "Do you miss them?" She didn't need to say who. I told her I did every day. She stared at the cloth in her hands before saying, "If I had a child, I think I'd fight harder." I said they had loved her, even if they hadn't shown it in the end. She gave a small nod, then asked if it was possible to start over. With time, I told her, and that seemed to settle something in her. By early afternoon, she was moving through the space as if it belonged to her too. While she tended the stew, I stacked kindling inside against the wall. It was the first time she'd taken over the kitchen without me setting it in motion. That night, we sat on the porch steps, the stars sharp above the canyon rim. She leaned her head lightly against my shoulder. "I dreamed they came back," she said. "My people. They said I had to go." My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "You're not going." She hesitated. "Part of me wants them to want me, but not enough to return." I told her she belonged where she could be herself. She said simply, "That's here." We didn't kiss. Not every moment called for it. But her words lingered longer than touch might have. When we went inside, she changed behind me, the sound of cloth shifting over skin quiet in the room. I didn't turn, just pulled back the blanket on the cot. When she joined me under it, her bare foot brushed mine, and this time, she didn't move away. I realized then that the tightness I'd carried since finding her on the rocks had eased without my noticing. The days slid by faster after that. Each morning she rose when I did her braid tied neat with a strip of leather from an old glove. Her feet had hardened against the stone paths, her steps sure. She walked with me along the ridge, watching as I worked on the wire. When I handed her the pliers, she took them without question, twisting a damaged section with a care that matched my own. It wasn't just about fixing the line. It was about building something together, even if it was only copper and wood for now. One cold morning she was sweeping the shed when I saddled the mule for a ride north. A section had been humming strange the night before, and I needed to see to it. It would be the first time in days we'd been apart more than an hour. She didn't say much, but her arms held me tighter before I mounted up. I fastened the mule's bell to the cabin door, so she'd hear it when I came back. I was gone until the sky turned red behind the ridge. Dust clung to my boots when I stepped down the saddlebag, heavy on my shoulder. She opened the door without a word, her arms circling my waist before I'd crossed the threshold. I set the bag down and held her until I felt the tightness leave her frame. All clear. No brakes, I said. She didn't let go right away. I kept thinking she murmured, "What if they came while you were gone?" I told her they hadn't. She nodded, but the look in her eyes said the thought had stayed with her. I promised I wouldn't leave long again. That night I brought out a small pouch I'd traded for on my last trip into Cold Brush Junction. I set it on the table between us. She untied the string slowly. Inside were sewing needles, colored thread, and a square of soft deerskin. Her fingers lingered on the fabric. "You traded for this?" I nodded. "Thought you might want to mend that dress proper. Maybe make something warmer." Her voice caught a little when she said no one had ever brought her anything like it before. "You weren't mine to bring it to," I told her. "Now you are." She stepped around the table and kissed me, firm, slow, certain. When she pulled back, she rested her forehead to mine. "Say it again," I whispered. "You're mine." That night as we lay under the blanket, she guided my hand down over her stomach. "I think I might be carrying," she said, her voice careful. My hand stayed still as I asked if she was sure. She'd missed 2 moons and felt different, she said. "You scared?" I asked. "Not of the child," she answered. "Just, if it's true, I don't want to do it alone." I told her she wouldn't. A tear slid along her temple as she said she never thought she'd be a mother, not after what had been said about her. I told her they'd been wrong. "Do you want it?" she asked. "I want anything that comes with you," I said. She closed her eyes, the tremor in her shoulders easing. That night we didn't touch beyond holding each other. My hand stayed over her belly until I felt her breathing slow into sleep. The frost came early that year. By late October, silver coated the porch rails in the mornings, and the mule's breath rose in pale clouds. The creek ran low and the wind carried the bite of higher ground. Inside, though, it stayed warm. She stood near the stove in a dress she'd sewn from the deerskin, the fit snug at her hips and clean at the neckline. Her belly was just beginning to round, and her hands rested there without thought. I sat at the workbench, rubbing oil into the old Henry rifle, my eyes drawn to her more often than the gun. She held up a tiny moccasin she'd been stitching. "Second one's taking longer," she said with a faint smile. I told her that babies walked crooked anyway. She laughed, soft but real. Then she set the shoe on the shelf beside the carved spoon I'd made months back. It looked like it had always belonged there. Later that morning, we packed the mule for a trip into Cold Brush Junction. It had been months since we'd left the canyon. The settlement was little more than a general store, a saloon, and a way station for the riders. As soon as we stepped onto the main street, eyes followed us, a white man and an Apache woman walking side by side. She kept her gaze low. I stepped closer and said quietly, "You're with me. Let them look." We walked into the general store together. The man behind the counter stiffened at the sight of her. I set down my list: flour beans, dried fruit soap, 2 pounds of salt, and a copper kettle if he had one. "She with you?" he asked flat. "She's my wife," I said. The word felt solid, like a stone set in place. He nodded and began packing the order. Outside, she stopped me at the mule. "You said wife." I met her eyes. I meant it. "You want to marry me, Sana?" she answered without pause. "Yes, I already have. We didn't wait for a preacher." Back at the cabin, she tied a strip from my coat lining around my wrist, and I tied a beaded piece of her old dress around hers. The wind moved through the canyon like it always had. But the place felt different when we stepped back inside. The days grew shorter and colder as frost edged the porch rails and the mule's breath curled in the morning chill. Inside the cabin, though, warmth gathered in small ways. Sana had sewn herself a dress from the soft deerskin I'd traded for the fit snug and quiet around her swelling belly. She moved slower now, careful where she stepped, but steadier, more at home. I watched her tie the frayed strap over one shoulder, her hands lingering there as if to feel the life growing inside her. The sun hardly warmed the canyon walls by late October, and the creek had slowed to a mere trickle. But inside, the fire kept the shadows at bay. I sat at the workbench, oiling the old Henry rifle, though my eyes kept drifting to her more than the gun. She held up a tiny moccasin she'd been sewing, the second taking longer than the first. "They'll walk crooked anyway," I said with a soft chuckle. Her smile was faint but real, and she placed the little shoe carefully on the shelf beside the carved cedar spoon I'd made months before. When we loaded the mule for a rare trip into Cold Brush Junction, the cold bit at our cheeks, but the weight of leaving the canyon after so long pressed heavier. The town was little more than a general store, a saloon, and a way station for riders. As we stepped onto the dirt street, eyes turned to watch us: a white man and an Apache woman walking side by side. Sana lowered her gaze, but I stepped closer and whispered, "You're with me. Let them look." We entered the store together. The man behind the counter stiffened when he saw her. I set my list on the counter: flour beans, dried fruit soap, 2 pounds of salt, and a copper kettle if he had one. "She with you?" he asked, his voice flat. "She's my wife," I said, and the words felt heavy, like setting a stone in place. The man blinked, then nodded, beginning to pack the order without further comment. Outside, Sana stopped me by the mule and said, "You said wife." I looked her in the eye and said plainly, "I meant it." "You want to marry me, Sana?" she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I already have." We didn't wait for a preacher or a gathering. Back at the cabin, she took a strip from my coat lining and tied it around my wrist. I tied a band made from beads on her old dress around hers. The wind whispered through the canyon, but inside the cabin, the world felt quieter, safer, somehow more settled than it ever had. Winter pressed deeper into the canyon, bringing mornings where breath hung in the air and the stove burned from before dawn until well after dark. The creek was rimmed with ice, and the mule's coat had grown thick against the cold. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, but closer, with the smell of stew wood smoke and the faint tang of leather oil lingering in the air. Sana's belly had rounded more in recent weeks. She wore the deerskin dress most days, now paired with a shawl she'd pieced together from scraps. One afternoon, we sat at the table, cleaning rabbit hides I'd brought in from the traps. She worked the edges with careful fingers, her braid falling forward over her shoulder. "I want to make something for the baby," she said without looking up. I told her we had time, but she shook her head slightly. "Better to start while I can still sit long without hurting." She set the hide aside and reached for the next, her movements slow but steady. We'd begun speaking more about the child, where the cradle would go, what herbs might be planted. Come spring, to help with fevers or colic. In the evenings, she read from an old booklet of household remedies left by the cabin's former owner, sounding out the words until they came smooth. Sometimes I'd work beside her at the bench, mending a cracked relay box or splicing wire, the two of us sharing the lamplight in silence. The trip into town had stirred something in her. She moved with more certainty now, not just inside the cabin, but along the ridge when she came with me to check the line. One cold morning, she pointed out a sag in the wire before I did. "It's catching on that branch," she said. We cut it free together, her gloved hands quick with the pliers. "You've got an eye for it," I told her, and she gave a small, proud smile. Supplies ran low sooner than expected. By midwinter, the flour barrel was light, and we were down to the last of the beans. I'd been thinking of another trip into Cold Brush Junction, but storms had been moving through the high pass for days, and the trail was slick with ice. We stretched what we had, thin biscuits broth made from the last bones in the pot, but the cold took more from a body than you could measure in meals. One evening, as I split kindling near the porch, Sana came to the door. "There's someone out there," she said quietly. I followed her gaze toward the far bend of the ridge. A figure on horseback was making its way along the narrow path, moving slow in the snow. We watched in silence until the rider came into view. A man in a dark coat, a wide hat pulled low. I didn't recognize him at that distance. He rode past without looking our way, the sound of the hooves fading into the canyon. The sight put me on edge. Strangers didn't come this far unless they had business, and business out here rarely meant good. I checked the rifle that night, laying it within reach of the bed. Sana said nothing, but she sat closer to the stove than usual, her eyes drifting to the door whenever the wind rattled it. A few days later, the snow eased enough for me to ride into town. Sana helped pack the saddlebag, tucking in a folded scrap of deerskin she'd been stitching into a cap for the baby. "Bring it back safe," she said. The trail was quiet, but I kept watch over the ridges until the junction came into sight. The storekeeper greeted me with a nod, his eyes flicking to the list in my hand. As he measured out the flour, he said, "Had a fella in here asking after you." Didn't give a name. I kept my face even, but my mind turned over the image of the rider on the ridge. "What did he want?" I asked. Said he was headed south. Asked if you still kept that cabin in the canyon. The storekeeper slid the flour across the counter. Didn't tell him much, didn't like the look of him. I thanked him and finished the trading quick. The ride back felt longer. The wind had a sharper edge, and every shadow along the trail looked like it might hold someone waiting. When I reached the cabin, Sana was at the door before I dismounted. "You were longer than I thought," she said. I handed her the bag. My eyes scanning the canyon rim. "We might have company before long," I told her. She set the bag on the table, her hands still on the straps. "Do you know who?" I shook my head. "Not yet." She straightened her expression firm. "Then we keep watch." That night I stoked the stove high and sat by the window, the rifle across my knees. Sana moved quietly behind me, setting the kettle near the coals. Outside the canyon was still, but the feeling of being alone in it had shifted. Toward dawn, I heard the distant sound of hooves again. Faint, then gone. When the light came, I saw no sign of a trail in the fresh snow, but I knew better than to think it was over. Sana must have sensed the same. She stood at the doorway, looking out into the white, her shawl pulled tight. "If he comes," she said softly, "we'll be ready." Snow held to the north-facing slopes long after it melted from the open ground. The days came brighter, but the air stayed sharp, each breath carrying the dry scent of cedar smoke from the stove. Sana moved slower now, her hands often resting on her belly, though she still swept the stoop when the sun reached it. We kept the fire high and the doors latched, both of us listening for sounds that didn't belong. It was near mid-morning when I saw the rider again. He was a dark mark against the white ridge, his horse picking its way along the narrow trail. I stood in the shadow of the cabin until he disappeared behind the bend, the rhythm of hooves fading into the canyon's echo. Sana stepped to the door behind me. "Same man?" she asked. I nodded. Same coat, same horse. Her eyes narrowed. He's looking for something. That night, I set the rifle across the table while we ate. She noticed but didn't say anything. After supper, I checked the oil and worked the lever until it moved clean. Sana sat in the chair by the fire, her sewing in her lap, watching my hands. When I set the rifle aside, she said, "If he comes here, we stand together." I told her that was the only way it would be. 2 days later, I saddled the mule for a short run south along the wire. Sana helped me pack a strip of jerky, 2 biscuits, and a coil of fresh line. The morning was bright, but a low haze clung to the canyon floor. I promised I'd be back before sundown. She nodded, but held my arm a moment longer than usual before letting go. The trail was quiet until I reached the southern post near the dry arroyo. That's where I saw fresh hoof prints in the frost, deeper than my mule's, and set at a slow walk. I followed them east until they turned off into the rocks, heading toward a cut that offered a view down into the canyon. From there, a man could watch the cabin without showing himself. I didn't linger. The sun was already leaning west, and the air had a heavier feel to it. When I reached home, Sana was on the porch, shawl pulled tight. "You're late," she said, her eyes going past me to the ridge. "Did you see him?" I told her about the prince and the lookout. She didn't speak, just moved inside and stirred the stew on the stove. That night, neither of us slept much. I kept the rifle close, listening for the crack of a twig or the shift of snow. Once, near midnight, the mule gave a short, low snort. I stepped outside, boots crunching in the frost. The moon lit the canyon pale, but I saw no movement. When I came back in, Sana was still sitting by the fire, the sewing untouched in her lap. By morning, the wind had picked up, carrying loose snow across the ridge in thin, twisting sheets. I stayed close to the cabin, stacking wood and checking the traps along the creek. Toward afternoon, I found the nearest trap empty, but sprung the bait gone. The snow around it was disturbed not by a rabbit, but by a man's boot. The prints led off toward the same cut I'd seen before. When I returned, Sana was mending the hem of the shawl. I set the empty trap on the table. "Someone's been close," I told her. She met my eyes and set down the needle. Then, we're past waiting. We spent the next hour moving what we needed within arm's reach: water blankets, cartridges for the rifle, the axe by the door. She boiled coffee while I checked the locks on the shutters. As evening fell, the sky turned a hard, clear blue, and the wind dropped. Every sound carried. I sat by the window with the rifle across my knees. Sana moved quietly, setting the lamp low and drawing the curtain. The smell of coffee and wood smoke hung between us. She took the chair across from me. "You think he'll come tonight?" she asked. I listened a moment before answering. If he's been watching, he knows we're ready. We stayed like that as the light went, the room dim except for the glow from the stove. Outside, the canyon settled into silence. Then faint but clear came the sound of hooves on frozen ground. Slow, measured drawing closer. Sana's eyes found mine. We didn't speak. The sound grew until it reached the edge of the porch. Then it stopped. A long pause followed, the kind that makes a man aware of his own heartbeat. The mule shifted in the corral, then stilled again. I moved to the door, the rifle steady in my hands. Sana stood behind me, one hand on the frame. A knock came, 3 slow raps against the wood. The knock came again, slower this time, the sound carrying in the still air. I eased the latch, but kept the door braced with my boot. The man on the porch stood just beyond the lamplight, hat pulled low, a scarf covering his mouth. He smelled faintly of horse and wood smoke. "I'm looking for a woman," he said, voice muffled by the scarf. "Apache. Young, might have come this way." Sana was still behind me, her hand gripping the frame. I shifted so she was out of his line of sight. "No one like that here," I told him. The man tilted his head, as if weighing the truth of it. Funny, he said her kin said she was headed for these canyons. I stepped forward, making sure the barrel of the rifle caught the light. You've been riding the ridge, I said, watching my place. That ends tonight. His eyes narrowed above the scarf. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he shifted his weight boots, creaking against the boards. Suit yourself, he said, backing toward his horse. But she belongs to them. They'll come. He mounted without turning his back to me, then rode into the darkness. I stayed on the porch until the sound of hooves faded into the canyon. Inside, Sana sank into the chair by the fire. He's from my tribe, she said quietly. Not blood kin, but tied to them. They sent him to bring me back. She looked at the floor. If they can't, they'll send more. We kept the lamps low that night. I sat near the window until the fire burned down to coals. No more riders came, but I didn't sleep. At first light, I saddled the mule and rode to the nearest telegraph station 15 miles west. The wind off the ridge cut sharp, and I kept my coat collar high. The station master, a man named Silas Crane, 52, was pouring coffee when I stepped inside. I told him I needed to get a message to Sheriff Dodd in Calhoun. His brow lifted at the name. Trouble, he asked. Not yet, I said, but it's looking that way. He sent the wire while I stood by the stove warming my hands. By the time I rode back, the sun was low and the sky streaked with red. Sana was splitting kindling by the shed, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. She looked relieved when she saw me, though her eyes kept drifting toward the ridge. That night after supper, I told her the sheriff would send word in a day or two. And if he doesn't come, she asked. I set my cup down. Then it's just us. 2 days passed before a rider appeared, a deputy named Vernon Pike, 31, carrying a folded note from Sheriff Dodd. It said he'd be in Calhoun for another week on court business, but would ride out after. In the meantime, he advised caution. Vernon stayed for coffee, his eyes often moving to Sana. She kept busy at the stove, saying little. When he rose to leave, he paused at the door. If you see that rider again, fire a shot. I'll be patrolling the North Trail. The next morning brought fresh tracks near the creek. One set led straight toward the cabin before turning off into the trees. I followed them for a quarter mile until they vanished in rocky ground. When I came back, Sana was waiting on the porch, her hand resting on her belly. They're close, she said. We brought in extra water and moved more wood inside. I kept the rifle loaded and the axe near the door. The air felt tight, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. Toward dusk, the mule began pacing the corral. Ears pricked. I stepped outside and heard a faint clatter of hooves on stone, then silence. The sound came again from higher up the ridge, then stopped. I scanned the slope until my eyes caught movement, 2 riders barely visible in the failing light, watching from the shadows of the pines. I didn't raise the rifle. Instead, I stood in the open, letting them see I'd seen them. After a moment, they turned their horses and melted into the trees. Sana joined me on the porch. They're measuring us, she said. We stayed outside until the stars came out, then went in and barred the door. The firelight played across the walls, the only sound the slow tick of the clock on the shelf. Whatever came next, I knew it would be soon. The night after we spotted the riders, the air stayed sharp and still, the kind that carried every sound. I kept the rifle across my knees, the lamplight low. Sana sat near the hearth, her eyes fixed on the shadows under the door. Close to midnight, hoofbeats echoed off the ridge. This time, they didn't stop at the tree line. 2 riders came into view, leading a 3rd horse between them. I stepped out before they could dismount. One of them pulled back his scarf. It was the same man from the porch. We've come for her, he said. No need for trouble. I could hear the creak of leather as Sana stood behind me. She's not leaving, I told him. The 2nd rider shifted in his saddle hand, resting near the butt of his revolver. That was when a voice called from the dark behind them. You heard him turn around. Deputy Vernon Pike rode up with 2 other men from Calhoun lanterns, swinging from their saddles. The light caught the faces of the riders, showing them for what they were, worn, desperate, and not ready for a fight they couldn't win. The man who had spoken to me first looked at Sana once, then turned his horse. "You've made your choice," he said, and they rode back into the night. Vernon stayed until dawn, walking the perimeter, while I kept watch at the window. When the first light touched the ridge, Sana stepped onto the porch. She breathed in the cold air, her shoulders easing for the first time in days. A week later, Sheriff Dodd arrived. He listened to the whole of it, then told Sana she was free to stay under the law's protection. Papers were drawn up, giving her rights no one could question. That spring, she planted a small garden behind the cabin. I built a fence to keep out the mule, and we hauled water together from the creek. Life found a quieter pace, marked by the rhythm of seasons instead of the threat of riders on the ridge. Looking back now, I know that night on the porch wasn't just about keeping her safe. It was about choosing what kind of life would grow here. Out in this country, a home isn't given. It's made defended and kept by those willing to stand when it counts. If you've ever had to fight for a place or a person worth keeping, you know that truth. And maybe you found, like I did, that once you make that stand, you never stand quite the same way again. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it's left you thinking of your own, I hope you'll carry it forward and share it with someone who might need to hear it.